Before sharing with you the text from the Gospel of Matthew, I share with you one additional verse from the book of Hebrews. I am reading from Hebrews, the 10th chapter, the 25th verse. Listen for God's holy word. Don't stop meeting together with other believers, which some people have gotten into the habit of doing. Instead, encourage each other, especially as you see the day drawing near. And from the hand of Matthew, in Matthew's Gospel, the 8th chapter, verse 26. He said to them, "Why are you afraid, you people of weak faith?" Then he got up and gave orders to the winds and to the lake, and there was a great calm. God's holy word. Friends, many of us can do a better job at managing our fears, particularly after this past year, and as we face the uncertainties of the year we have just entered. Many of us can do a better job at managing our fears, for fear is widespread and infinitely varied. Most psychologists and counselors will tell us that fears are natural and necessary. That is why this sermon title is not eliminating our fears in the new year, but mastering our fears in the new year, or putting it another way, managing our fears positively so that they don't cripple us as we move forward through life. Fears are natural because of life's uncertainties, and they are necessary because they alert us to exercise caution in the face of danger. So fears are natural and fears are necessary, but they do not have to cripple us. Now, I mentioned that our fears are infinitely varied. Some of our fears are ours due to an inheritance. We inherit fears from those who raised us. My mother was terrified to drive a vehicle over a bridge. Consequently, today, as a 60-year-old man, I am terrified to drive a vehicle over a bridge. When we go to Key West, my wife drives. I simply can't drive over bridges and remain calm. Some of our fears are phobias. They're unexplained, and we can do little about them because we simply do not understand them. Some of our fears come from a traumatic experience, and we often call those post-traumatic syndrome. And most of us cannot move through a PTS syndrome without professional care. And then there are the fears that I will call the unnecessary anxieties. Fears such as the fear of failure or the fear of success, the fear of illness or the fear of death, the fear of never meeting a significant person to share life with, the fear of remaining alone all of our lives. These are needless anxieties, and these are the fears that are addressed by the Scriptures today. In our first reading from Matthew's Gospel, we discover Jesus Christ addressing the disciples who are afraid in a boat in a stormy sea. And Jesus asks, "Why are you afraid?" If you peel it away, bit by bit by bit, what you discover is that Jesus Christ is offering the first way to move positively through our fears. That is to ask, why am I afraid? Most psychologists will tell you today that once you can identify why you're afraid, you take a positive step toward diminishing the power of that fear in your life. Why are you afraid? Friends, in my former church in Bucks County, there was a young man deeply loved by the congregation, but perhaps he was deeply loved because they saw the struggle he had with day-to-day life. He was different than other people. You couldn't tell it by looking at him, but you could tell it by his behavior. He didn't seem to have the proper social skills. He seemed to alienate people rather than to draw people toward him, though he loved people dearly and wanted to have deep and meaningful friendships. He just seemed to lack certain social graces. He graduated from high school, began college, and had to drop out of college because of the way his mind functioned, which resulted in a behavior that seemed to be off-putting to other people. He contemplated suicide a number of times. His parents had him see one counselor after another, and each time he saw a counselor, he received some help. He so appreciated people who cared for him, who listened intently to him, but he still was afraid. He was afraid and he was anxious because he knew that he was different, and other people knew that he was different, and he didn't know what to do about it. Until one day his mother and father found someone who took a more scientific approach to his behavior, began to study the patterns of his brain and how he would respond to different stimuli, and was able to give him a diagnosis and say, "You are different. Your brain functions differently from the rest of the world, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. You are not mentally ill. You're physically capable, and you're mentally capable of moving forward through life positively. All you need to do is to understand that your brain functions differently. And because your brain functions differently, you can now acquire the skills that come naturally to other people. You can acquire the skills by intense effort to fit in with other people." He returned to college, graduated from college, has now a few close friends, and is successful in the career of his choice. What he did was he asked the question, why am I afraid? Why am I different? And once he was given the answer to that, then he proceeded by asking the question, what can I do about it? And then secondly, where do I need the help of others to move forward? What Jesus Christ is suggesting to us is that if we are going to manage our fears in this new year, we begin by asking the question, why am I afraid? Why am I afraid? And once I've identified it, ask, what can I do about it myself? And then where do I need help from others? Then we come to that passage in Hebrews that I shared with you just a moment ago that urges us to not separate ourselves from the community of believers, but rather to remain close to other people, meet regularly with other people so that we may offer encouragement to each other. What the scriptures want us to understand is that our fears can often be abated and courage can be strengthened by associating regularly with people who are not as fearful about a particular area or topic or concern as we are. Many of you are aware that some years ago I led a Macedonian ministry cohort for 3 years. To refresh your memory, Macedonian ministry is a national ministry where pastors are invited to become mentors to other pastors who are starting in ministry, or pastors who have been struggling in ministry in some way. The cohort leader, which I was one, would take a group of 7 to 10 pastors in the geographical region where we live and go through a monthly process of mentoring those pastors to greater effectiveness in ministry. It was a marvelous 3 years with the 7 pastors in South Florida that I worked with. And the Macedonian ministry experience concludes with a trip to the Holy Land with the National Director of Macedonian Ministries, Tom Toole, who is no stranger to any of you. He has been a personal mentor of mine for almost 20 years. So Tom Toole and I took our 7 pastors in the South Florida cohort, and we joined together with 10 other pastors from a North Dakota cohort with their leader, and we were in the Holy Land for 2 weeks. While we were there, I got to know a young woman from North Dakota who had just accepted a new call to go to another state, to a larger church with more responsibility, where she would now be responsible for a staff, mentoring a staff and supervising a staff, carrying much more responsibility than she was currently carrying in her own ministry. And she was fearful. She was afraid that she was not experienced enough for the challenge that was before her. She was afraid that she was not smart enough for the challenge that was before her. She was afraid that she was not seasoned enough to be the pastor that she was called to be in this new church. And she expressed that fear to Tom Toole, and she expressed it to me. And Tom said, here's my phone number, my home phone number. Day or night, call me at any time. I believe you're ready. I believe you're ready. You call me anytime you are concerned or have a question. I gave her my phone number, even though I was not her Macedonian ministry leader. I said, here's my number. Call me day or night. Anytime you're afraid, anytime you have a question, anytime you have a concern, give me a call. And she did. Once she moved, she called Tom Toole regularly, and she called me about this and about that, until finally Tom and I received a call from her one day, and she said, I want you to know, I got this. And it's because you were available to me, and you believed in me, and you were not afraid of exercising leadership in a large church. And because of your leadership, and because you were not afraid, and because I stayed close to you, my fear abated, and my strength grew. Hebrews urges us to remain in the community of other believers, particularly people who are less fearful than us about any particular matter or life concern, so that we may be encouraged and strengthened by them. And then finally, the third guidance that we find in Scripture for mastering our fears in the new year is directly from Psalm 23. Keeping our eyes fixed upon God. If you listened carefully to Psalm 23 as Greg read it for you earlier, or as Birgit sang it for us, you will notice an interesting shift that many people completely miss. There is a dramatic shift in Psalm 23, and it's a short psalm. The psalm begins talking about God, as I am doing with you now. I'm talking to you about God. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. The psalm is talking to us about God. And then the shift happens. It's like running over a speed bump that you didn't see coming. The personal pronoun changes. And the psalmist is no longer talking about God, but begins talking directly to God. Though I walk through a dark place and life is uncertain, I am not afraid, because you, God, you are with me. What the psalmist invites us to do is to talk less about God and talk more to God, to keep our eyes fixed on God, who strengthens us to face the uncertainties of life. Some of you here are aware that I've worked out for 2 years with a personal trainer, Bill Dorton. During the beginning of my training, he introduced to me lunges. Some of you know what those are. For me, it required taking 2 20-pound dumbbells in my hands and holding them by my side, and then going down on one knee, then coming back up, taking a step forward and going down on the next knee, and moving from one side of the gym to the other side doing this. I'm so glad you did not see me when I attempted it for the first time. I wandered all over the gym and I stumbled repeatedly, until Bill came alongside and said, Doug, I want you to pick out in the distance a focal point, a spot, a crack in the ceramic, anything, a bolt in the metal upright, anything. Pick out a spot and tell me when you found a spot. I said, Bill, I found a spot. He said, now fix your gaze on that spot and do not remove your eyes from that spot. Now proceed to do the lunges, going down on one knee, coming back up, taking a step forward, going down on the next knee. And as I kept my eyes fixed on that one spot, I moved forward steadily. This is what Psalm 23 is asking us to do. Fix our gaze upon God. That as we keep our gaze upon God, we are able to move through the fears and the uncertainties of life steadily. During my first year of studies at Columbia Theological Seminary, my godmother became seriously ill, Norma Carmichael. I learned that she had been rushed to the Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta. And I made arrangements to miss classes for the rest of the day and went immediately to the hospital to be by her side. When I walked in, her husband, J.R. Carmichael, and the physician moved to the corner of the room and began to discuss her condition in hushed tones. And I came alongside her, took her hand, and she giggled. Norma Carmichael, my godmother, seriously ill, giggled. And she looked in the direction of her husband and the physician. She said, "Look at them. They are so silly. They are so afraid. They are distracted." Then she looked at me and she said, I have fixed my eyes on Jesus, and they will not be moved, and I am not afraid. Later that week, I stood in a cemetery in Atlanta, and as my godmother's body was lowered into the ground, I began to sob. Not because I had lost someone I deeply loved, though that was true. I sobbed because her last witness to me that I fixed my eyes on Jesus. They will not be moved, and I am not afraid. Amen.